Hello, this is Professor Strickler, and this is a course in American government. This lesson is from Unit 2 about constitutional history, and it's Lesson 4 about the colonial political life. In this lesson, you'll learn about non-governmental institutions, economic equality, liberal democracy, salutary neglect, and local loyalty that were all features of colonial life. We'll do this by talking about 4 specific elements of political life in the colonies. The first of those can be seen in the founding of Plymouth Colony. Now, we've discussed this before in previous lessons. This is the colony founded by the Pilgrim Separatists, the religious dissenters, who left England to try to find a place where they could live their religion as they saw fit. Now, the thing I want you to notice about this was that this colony was essentially founded by a church. The church is what organized the people's lives in this colony. Their faith is what set the rules for them in this colony. It was not the government back in England dictating how the colony would be governed. Instead, it was the ideas of the people who ran the church. Now, in a similar way, the colony of Jamestown was again not founded by the government, but founded by a private entity, in this case, the Virginia Company, which came to make a profit in the New World and settled Jamestown in Virginia. So like the Plymouth Colony, where the organizing feature in people's life was not the government, but a church, here in Jamestown, the organizing feature in people's lives was not a government, but it was a private company. From both of these examples, we get our first feature of political life in the colonies, and that was the importance of non-governmental institutions. There were other entities in people's lives that brought order to their existence besides the government. The next feature of political life in the colonies can be seen if we remind ourselves what we learned in a previous lesson about feudalism in Europe. Here's a diagram showing the basic idea of feudalism. You had one king and then a few dozens wealthy barons who were landowners who basically owned all the land. And then they had a few thousand knights that helped them keep control of their land holdings. But the vast majority of the people within the country, millions of people, were landless peasants who had nothing, who were forced to just live on the land of the barons and do what they wanted. So in a system like that in Europe, lots and lots of poor peasants scratching out a living in mud huts, and really, seriously, huts made out of mud and sticks where they slept with their animals in the winter. And in the same society that those people existed, have fabulously wealthy royal families building extravagant palaces. The economic disparity in these countries was, as much as we think about it being bad in America today, was unbelievable in comparison. Well, those people tended to stay in the old world. The filthy rich and the dirt poor didn't come because the filthy rich didn't want to. The dirt poor didn't have the money to. And so the people that came to America to become the colonial settlers sort of fit in a general middle class. At the low end were people who still were able to, as I've said in a previous lesson, throw an axe over their shoulder, go marching out into the woods, start chopping down trees, and build themselves a cabin and create their own life. At the upper end were people like George Washington, probably the richest man in America at the time of the founding of the United States of America, who built his home, Mount Vernon, in Virginia. Now, I have this photo of Mount Vernon here just to show you how it isn't a giant palace. It's about the size of maybe a middle-class home in America, upper middle-class home. The rooms are small. It doesn't have a lot of amenities and features, not gilded in gold, things like that. It's really a fairly normal house, particularly compared to the great wealth in Europe. So if this was the richest man in America, and you compare him to the settlers in their cabins in the woods, there's not nearly as much difference between them as there were between the peasants and the royal families in Europe. So from that, we get our second general principle of political life in the colonies, and that is of general economic equality. Everybody was members of sort of the same middle class. Now we move to our third principle, and we can see that, first of all, in the direct democracy that was practiced many places in the colonies, through town meetings, which I'd mentioned in a previous lesson, where the entire town would get together to decide issues facing them. So lots and lots of people were participating in the governance of their own lives. Now, along with that, in the colonies in general, there was a very liberal notion of suffrage. Groups of people who would stand no chance of participating in the political process back in Europe were allowed to participate in various places in America. In some colonies, for example, as illustrated in this picture, women were allowed to vote. In other colonies, black citizens were allowed to vote. Now, slaves were not allowed to vote. They'd have to be free black men, but they were allowed to vote, which was, again, way ahead of its time, just like allowing women to vote was. And this was a general attitude in the colonies. Now, they didn't always agree on who could vote, but they tended to be a lot more easy, open, or as we say here, more liberal with the right to vote, which is described by the word suffrage. That's what that word suffrage means, is it means the power to vote. So liberal suffrage means very open rules about who can vote. In some cases, people under the age of 18 could vote. In many cases, people who didn't own land, while land was a big requirement other places in the world, could vote. And so in the colonies, lots of people could participate in the political process. So from that, we get our third principle about political life in the colonies, about it being a liberal democracy. Lots of people freely participating in the political decisions. Our last element of political life in the colonies, we can see in this quote from the English politician Edmund Burke. Now, you've met Edmund Burke previously in this course when we held him up as the father of conservatism, the man who was criticizing the French Revolution, and in that criticism revealed some important philosophical ideas about not accepting the wisdom of a bunch of wise elites, but instead relying on the conclusions of history to decide why it might be best to do, and thus being cautious about change in the future. Well, that same man who looked at the French Revolution and thought it would be disastrous because it would change things too quickly, too harshly, too radically, he looked at the pending revolution in America and was actually fairly supportive of it. One of the things he recognized is that the American colonists had been essentially running their own lives for quite some time that had prepared them to be independent. And he described this idea to some extent in this quote here. He says that he knows that the colonies, in general, owe little to, as he puts it, their happy form, to being squeezed and constrained and watched over by the government. Instead, they owe their happy form. He realizes that life was going pretty well in the colonies. The people were coming, being successful, prospering, etc. They were in that condition because of what he calls here a wise and salutary neglect. Now, let's think about what that means for a moment. The word salutary has the same root as salute. It means a respectful, a good thing. But the word that comes right after it, neglect, is something that we generally think of as being bad. When we neglect someone, we leave them alone, we should be taking care of them. What he's saying here is that the colonists in America were essentially left alone by the British government to govern themselves. And in one particular way that's going to be really relevant as we move on in this course, they were not taxed by the British government. The British government let them come, set their own rules, govern themselves, and in particular, not have to give up their property or their money to the government back in England. And they got very used to that and prospered in it. So from that, we get our fourth principle. Our fourth principle of political life in the colonies is this notion of salutary neglect, that the government back in England left them alone, let them set their own rules, and didn't tax them. So we add all this together, we see that the colonists were relatively economically and politically equal. And at the same time, they were very disconnected from the government back in England, while being very connected to their communities here, where non-governmental institutions helped govern their lives. And so from these ideas, we get a general principle, and that is that while the colonists continue to call themselves Englishmen as they settle the New World, and continue to think about their heritage of Englishmen that we previously discussed, like the ideas found in the Magna Carta and the English Bill of Rights, their loyalties were much more naturally centered on their local community, full of people like themselves, who had similar beliefs, similar experience from a similar economic class, who practiced similar sorts of politics. So now let's summarize what we learned in this lesson with some questions. First of all, which is an example of a non-governmental institution? Is it the Massachusetts Body of Liberties, the Massachusetts General Court, the Virginia House of Burgesses, or the Virginia Company of London? Now, hopefully you'll recall that the correct answer is the Virginia Company of London. That's who settled Jamestown in Virginia, that I used as an example in this lesson of a non-governmental institution, a business organizing people's lives in that area. Next question. Who was the richest man in America? Was it George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, Patrick Henry? The correct answer, as you saw when I showed his home of Mount Vernon, is George Washington. And remember, I showed you that to show how unremarkable his home was, to establish just how relatively equal people were in the colonies. Next question. Who could not vote in America? Slaves, blacks, men without property, women? Amazingly, there are at least some places in the colonies where women could vote, places where men without property vote, places where black citizens could vote. The only people who really couldn't anywhere were slaves. Next question. What was salutary neglect? Was it not having any military draft? Was it not collecting any taxes? Was it mandatory social gestures? Or was it a prison release program? The correct answer was it was a failure to collect taxes on the part of the government. The government in England left the people here in the Americas alone, and they got used to being left alone, including not paying taxes. So where did the colonists' loyalties lie then, based on these realities of their political lives? They lie with the Catholic Church, with the British Empire, with their local institutions, or with the East India Company. As I've illustrated in this lesson, their loyalties were primarily focused on their local institutions, their churches, their companies, their local community, their friends and neighbors who they shared things with. This is why they really started to think of themselves as Virginians or Pennsylvanians or Georgians rather than thinking themselves any longer as Englishmen. Even though they used the name Englishmen, they thought of themselves as part of communities here. That does it for this lesson. The next lesson from Unit 2 will be Lesson 5 about the tax rebellion that led to the American Revolution.